Hi, thank you so, am I on? I think I'm on. Sweet. Yes. Perfect. Hi. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here. And I'm coming to all of you who are in New Zealand from the past, which is very fun and kind of bizarre. I feel way cooler than I am. I feel like a time traveler because of time zones. It is actually Tuesday night here on the West Coast of the United States where I am. So that's fun. But thank you so, so much for having me as part of Out on the Shelves. I'm really excited to be here. Super excited to talk about queer books and writing and all that fun jazz. And huge, huge, huge thank you to Erin Faye, who coordinated all of this and made it happen via internets and time zones and making online things do things they don't want to do, like make multiple of us be able to go live together on YouTube. So yay! Super excited to be here. So a little bit about me, sort of in a nutshell. I like to say that I am a zinester who grew up to be an award-winning author, something blah, 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 like that. Basically what that means is I write books, and I write really, really queer books. I currently live, as Erin said, in Portland, Oregon, but I recently relocated back here after almost 13 years in New York City, where I've been writing all kinds of queer books. So that's sort of the basic info about me as a person, but I think is more interesting are my books. So I'm a full-time writer, which basically means I spend all day making things up and making fun queer things up, and that is exciting. I mostly write books that are queer books for queer readers. That's sort of the own voices idea is really, really important to me. And that there are straight people and cis people who might read my work and might really enjoy my work, and that's exciting, but the books aren't for them. Like, if they want to read them, that's great, and I appreciate it, but that I'm not gonna hold their hand through those stories. So the books that I write really center and prioritize sort of insider queer community language, writing books for LGBTQ plus people, sort of really centering our language, our bodies, our relationships, etc., and not defining those things, really sort of framing sort of an insider language there. That's something that's really important to me. Really quickly, thought I would talk about my books in some sort of armfold way. I write a lot of different things. My first book was Kicked Out, which was a Lambda Literary Award finalist, and it came out, it actually turned 10, which is kind of bizarre to me, that is 10 years old now, but it was the first book that is a collection of stories from current and former homeless LGBTQ youth, mostly from around the United States. There is one contributor who's in the UK, that ranged in age from youth who were homeless when the book was published to the oldest contributor who had come out pre-Stonewall. So that was my first book is nonfiction. And then I do a lot of fiction things. Wrote a novel called Roving Pack. I can hold books. I can hold my own books. That's fun. And then probably I am in many ways best known for my novel Lost Boy, which is also a Lambda Literary finalist for transgender fiction several years ago. And it's a queer retelling of Peter Pan. And I write other fiction. I write some nonfiction about my queer lives. And sometimes I write picture books. So I do a lot of different kinds of things. And just sort of to quickly frame it, you know, I think sort of talking about writing, that was one of the things we wanted to talk about in this video. You know, how do we write queer stories? What does that look like for those of us who are writers? And I wasn't always a writer. And I like to say that because I feel like I often go to conversations with authors and they're like, I've been writing novels since I could hold a pen. And I'm like, that's really cool. That was not my experience. And so I didn't start writing until I was 17, when I went to my first queer youth center and I met other homeless LGBTQ youth, and we started making zines together. And the first thing I ever published in a zine was a story about how much I love boxed macaroni and cheese and running away from home and how abusive my mom was. And somehow those things all worked together in the magic of zines into a story. But so that was sort of my start to writing at 17. I have like little notes here. Is there anything else I'm missing? That was my start. I wrote zines, zine culture, fun times. But for me, you know, writing is really about creating connection. That's really what draws me to the page and draws me to creating queer stories. It's about connecting to other LGBTQ folks and creating worlds on the page that look like the same kind of magical, wonderful, complicated, sometimes messed up queer worlds and lives and families and relationships that I've experienced or I've seen. And that's really important to me, I think, and particularly thinking about creating those spaces for marginalized LGBTQ readers. So creating stories that center runaways and homeless youth and created families and chosen families and trans folks and genderqueer folks. And that's really the core of it for me. That's what I'm most interested in, both as a fiction writer and in my nonfiction work. Yeah. And then, you know, related to that, I think most of the inspiration for my work comes right back from the community, that it's all very intersectional to me, that I am, you know, writing stories by, for LGBTQ readers, and those same readers and those same communities are what inspire me the absolute most. I've had the incredible privilege of facilitating writing workshops with LGBTQ youth in shelters and drop-in programs across the United States. And I'm always so inspired by those spaces and just any, you know, talking to folks. This is so exciting. And that's, you know, the ability to connect with other people who have had some or different, but somehow connected experiences always inspires me. So that's me in a pretty fast nutshell of my work. And I know we're going to do some conversations and that stuff too. Oh, we were supposed to talk about our favorite books. Are we doing that now or is that happening later? Now? Okay. I'm like looking at thumbs up. Now's. Okay. So I brought them with me because I decided it was show and tell because I thought that would be very fun. These are my books. That's awkward. Okay. My books, not the favorite books I was going to talk about. So it was really hard to pick which ones I was going to bring because books, and I have lots of books. One of them that I didn't grab actually is Dorothy Allison's 2 or 3 Things I Know for Sure, and I don't know why it's not in my stack, but it's not. So that's one of them. But then I tried to pick things that I feel like have inspired my writing in some way, and I wanted to do kind of a mix of older things and newer things and things that maybe are small press, because small press and indie publishing is really important to me. So this is one. This is Godspeed by Lenny Breedlove that I absolutely love. Punk novel. It's fantastic. I don't know when it was published. When was it published? I can tell you. 2002. Right. So this is like this was like literally the year I came out. This is when this was published. The next one is Stone Butch Blues. It is out of print, Leslie Feinberg, but it is available in a PDF form for free online places. Leslie in Here Will made it free on the internet. This book is very beloved and I've taught it before, hence all the weird little sticky notes. This is an indie one, and this one is beat up because I used to carry it around in my backpack every day when I was like 18. And I think that's Kool-Aid or hair dye that's all over it, but this is my original copy of it. And this is Boys Like Her by the collective Taste This, which was a Vancouver, BC collective. And it is probably the most zine-rific book. I'm looking for a picture that's not going to get us in trouble on YouTube. So it's like this combination of art and story, and it's fantastic. And the author Ivan Coyote is in here back in the day before. I think this was the first book Ivan was ever in, but I love it. And then I have 2 more. Zoe Whittle's Bottle Rocket Hearts. It's a queer femme novel from Canada. Also set in the late 90s. I feel like it was published in the early 2000s. 2007. It was published mid 2000s, but it's fantastic. And then a brand new book. It's my last one. By Nicole Georges, who's an amazing queer femme comic artist, and it's Fetch, How a Bad Dog Brought Me Home, and it is absolutely one of my favorite books of all time. I knew Nicole back when we were both zinesters in Portland a bajillion years ago, and now she creates gorgeous graphic novels, graphic memoirs, I guess. But so those are some of my favorite books. Yeah, that's what I got, and I'm happy. I'm an open book. I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm trying to figure out how to see. That's the thing I didn't test, was how to see a live thing.
I'm going to unmute, and hopefully that doesn't mess up the audio. But do you want me to read the questions that you've got so far?
Ooh, that would be incredible. Thank you.
Okay, so first question is, what are some of your favourite queer novels, which you have covered? What is your favourite book that you've written?
Oh God. Okay. Yeah. I feel like I talked about some of my favorite books that to read, and those are hard. It's hard to pick, but that was sort of a stack I came up with today. My favorite book I've written, that's a hard one. I feel like it's probably Lost Boy, particularly because of the community response to it, because of how much I know that it connected with readers, which is kind of the best thing I can imagine, and how many people have sent me emails or messaged me on social media that they have tattoos from the book. Like I can't think of like anything more sort of like you have made it as like a queer punk author, that people are like tattooing your book on like their body, or like cosplaying your book. There have been multiple like cosplay like things I've been sent from Tumblr, like act out things, or like in-person events. And yeah, so probably Lost Boy.
I feel like tattooing is next level amazing. That's so good.
That feels like the way. Yeah, it can't get better than that.
Yeah, no, that is the #1 goal. What are some genres that you'd love to see rainbow stories told in?
Ooh, all genres. I think that we need way more representation across all genres, and I think that's something that is happening slowly, but I'm always excited when I see, even if it's genres I don't like I'm not a horror reader, but I'm so excited when I see like queer horror books coming out, because I feel like breaking into all of those genres is so necessary. Yeah, so all of them.
I feel like queer horror there's just been an explosion in the last little while as well. Like I know that Northwest Press is putting out a big queer horror zine that I think the Kickstarter just finished.
Mm-hmm.
But also just in general, there is a lot more overtly queer stories being told through horror, even though a lot of horror sort of traditionally does involve a queer theme.
Yes, 100%. I'm so excited that all those folks are sort of making those worlds happen.
A question that we've got through email is, what general life advice would you give your teenage self?
Whoa, that's a hard question. So my teenage self, I ran away from home when I was 17. And I lived with some adult friends, and they read my journal, and they figured out that I was queer, and they kicked me out. And so my later teenage self had a very different lived experience than like my early teenage self, who was like fairly sheltered and living in like suburbia / sort of rural areas. I think the biggest advice I would give myself though is to really encourage me to continue to create community. And it's what I ultimately did. And it's what ultimately saved me, was creating family and creating community. And so I would tell my teenage self that it's okay to do that. And really, encourage me to do it.
So another email question was, what general, or do you have a dream project, book, comic that you'd love to create and collaborate on that for some reason you can't right now?
Ooh, probably. It's kind of an interesting question. I would have answered that question really differently like 3 months, well, no more than that, like a year ago. Because in some ways, one of my sort of dream projects to create was my hybrid memoir that just came out, Healing, which is this book that I've wanted to write for like 10 years. And it's blending all of my queer work with all of my dog work, because I have sort of this secondary writing career where I write about dogs and dog behavior and dog training. And there's a lot of intersection to sort of what happened as I came out as a teenager. And so this book is both hybrid in form on the page. It is, oh, can I find an interesting page? It's like playing with form and it's combining queerness with all of these dog stories that I wanted to write. So that has been my big, would have been the answer, but it came out in May. So beyond that, I would say, yes, I sort of have this constant Rolodex in my head of projects that I want to be working on. If I could just figure out a way to squeeze a few more hours in the day, but hopefully soon.
What project would you love to see someone else do so that you don't have to?
Ooh. That's a really hard question. I am so excited about projects that are happening. I actually just raced home. I was at a reading for a YA novel called, oh, don't mess up the name. Oh, don't mess up the name. Was it When We All Had Wings? I'm going to mess that up. It's not that. Hold on. But it's this new YA novel that's fantastic. This is the thing that's the problem of doing live things when you try to talk about things. That is based in San Francisco, and it's all about, I have not read it yet, but I am so excited. All of Us with Wings. There we go. By Michelle Ruiz-Kale, and it is based in San Francisco, post-punk San Francisco, created family, trauma survivor, and YA, and truly marketed as YA. And I think that is just the bee's knees. My first novel, Roving Pack, got honored by the American Library Association as YA. I didn't conceptualize of it as YA, but I am so excited for people that are like sort of busting down all of these barriers and writing really complicated, really honest, gritty work within YA. Yeah.
And what advice would you give to someone who maybe loves writing or wants to learn to write or wants to get their work picked up and published, like budding authors or aspiring budding authors? What advice do you give to them?
Oh my God, right. That's my big piece of advice, is just do it. Send it out. And it can be really overwhelming and really scary to do. But if you don't send work out, and whatever that means, that might mean answering calls for submissions for anthologies. It might mean making your own zines. It might mean posting your stories on Tumblr. It might mean, any number of things, writing full novels and trying to get an agent, writing full novels and trying to get small presses to publish them on their own, or publishing them yourself. Whatever sort of getting stories out into the world feels good to you or makes sense to you, do it, is really my biggest piece of advice. And to know that, like, yes, you're going to get rejection. I get rejected all the time. I send work out all the time. I get rejected all the time for it. But if you don't send it out, you don't have a chance of it ever getting there. And we all need your stories. So send it out. Do it.
And one more, what's the best thing that came out of your writing?
Oh my God. Everything sounds like a really bad answer, but in so many ways, I can't even imagine what my life would be like if I wasn't writing. Like everything from the communities that I have to sort of the life I get to live is so much because of writing. That I started writing at this really critical point in my life, like within weeks of becoming homeless and running away. And so in so many ways, everything I've built has been built alongside writing, when whatever form writing has taken in my life at that time. And so, yeah, I think, being able to have created a life that is filled with fun and joy and love, and then being able to share that with the world through my writing and connect to other people who come from similar places as me, I think is probably, you know, the best thing I've experienced from it.
And I just thought of one more. And what do you think the future of queer books is and rainbow books?
I think it's limitless. I think there's been so much amazing change and growth, like just in the, you know, the last decade that I've been publishing books. You know, it's wild to me that Kicked Out turns 10 this year, and the amount of change I've seen in that time is wild. And when I talk to friends of mine who've been publishing, you know, queer books for 20 years, 30 years, like, you know, I don't even think we can imagine what's coming next. I think that the kind of representation that we've seen, the kind of expansion and genre sort of just like absolute busting that's happening from LGBTQ plus writers is only going to continue. And I can't wait to see where the next generation of queer writers takes it.
I've got a few more questions from the live chat. Compass Ramsey says, what's your writing process like?
That's a really good question. So it's changed a lot. So until a year and a half ago, I worked full-time as the director of a very large LGBTQ drop-in center for homeless youth in New York City. And so I wrote my novel Lost Boy, and I wrote Roving Pack on the subway in New York, commuting to and from my day job. And if I could steal away a lunch break at my bubble tea shop down the corner, that's where I wrote my books. And so I was writing, standing on the New York subway on my phone and then on my iPad. And so that was what my writing process looked like. And so it was very sort of in these bursts where I had to get it out. I had to get this text out on the page because then I had to like go do my job. And now, so a year and a half ago, I was able to quit my job and I'm writing full time. And so now it's this whole different world where I'm able to really sit in my rainbow bubblegum room and like write all day. And that it just feels like this immense privilege that is how I get to create now. And so I try to write, I try to write Monday through Friday. I try to take evenings off and weekends off, but I'm always thinking of story ideas. I'm always jotting them down. But I definitely try to write all day now.
It's amazing that shift from going from just trying to squeeze it in and then having the luxury of time and space to feel through things.
Yes, I feel incredibly lucky.
Also, your room just looks like a beautiful place to work.
I think so. Thank you.
So good. Kirsty Wynn asks, on the topic of queer YA, I feel so many feelings when I read books now that I wish I were around when I was a teenager. This is to both of us. Is there a particular book that evokes that feeling for you, a book that you would have loved to have as part of your resources as a teen?
Yeah, I mean, so the first queer book I ever read, or the first LGBT book I ever read, was Am I Blue, which is an anthology that came out in the 90s, and I bought it at the Barnes and Noble, which is like a big box bookstore. I don't know if they're in New Zealand or not. And I hid it under my bed, and it was like great because it was the first time I'd ever seen like gay characters in a book, but it was also like completely not my experience. It was like these parents that were like kind of upset, but then they were like super accepting like a minute later. And I was like, oh my God, this isn't my experience. And so that the experience of there being so little representation, and that representation that did exist not in any way speaking to me, was really the catalyst for all of the writing. It was the reason I did Kicked Out, but definitely in terms of novels, it's something I think about, even though I don't generally consider myself a YA writer, though I'm working on a YA novel right now. But that aside, is something I think about in all of my work of this is the book I wanted. And if it wasn't a book that I wanted at some point in my life, whether that was when I was a teenager or in my early 20s or now, like if it's not that, then it's not the right book for me to be working
on. I think for me, there's lots of books that that were around when I was a teenager, but I didn't have access to them because, I was at Catholic school and I was deeply self-hating and just I was living in a really small town, like it just didn't have access to them. But I remember finding a book called Annie on My Mind at a book sale in Dunedin when I got to university. And that book has been around since, I don't know, the 70s, I think, maybe the 80s. And
it's one of my favorites too.
It's so good. And when I read that as a 20-something-year-old, I feel like I was reading it for my 15-year-old self.
Yeah.
We've got another question that's come through as well. Was there a book you read when you were younger that gave you that kind of click of, oh yeah, this is me?
Yeah, I think that Dorothy Allison's Two or Three Things I Know for Sure, which I should have put in this stack, definitely did to some extent. But really, the Boys Like Her book, I remember I got it actually from one of my first writing mentor was named Linda Hummer, and she lent me this book, and I didn't return it. I told her I lost it, and then before she died a few years ago. I actually was living in New York, and we emailed, and I was like, I have the book. I didn't lose it, and she was like, I know you didn't lose the book, but I couldn't give it back. And it was hard to find. And so literally, I think this is like hair dye and Kool-Aid, like literally hair dye and Kool-Aid. That's like the redness on this cover is not part of the cover art. And because it lived in my backpack. It was the first time I saw stories of queer folks and gender non-conforming queer folks that were like, looked like me and looked like the kinds of lives I had and like the messy relationships I was in. I was like, this is my book. So I carried it everywhere. Yeah.
Cool.
And stuck bumper stickers in it. I just saw that inside the cover. This was a campaign that I worked on in like 2005 or something.
Well, I know that it's really late where you are, so we are so grateful that you came and had a chat with us. Thank you so much for sharing your experience and talking to people in Aotearoa tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun. I was so excited to be here, and the magic of the internet made it possible for me to travel to the future. So hello tomorrow. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for time traveling with us.
Yay, thank you so much.
All right, Sam, I think we're going to switch over to you.
Okay.
If I can figure it out.
Okay.
There you go. Hopefully.
Oh, I'm just turning my things off. Whoa.
Please stand by while we, who are not tech people, figure this out.
Okay, I think I've done it. I'm back.
Yay.
I was just switching myself on and off.
Great.
I might start with the last question that was asked around the if there was a book that you read that you were like, oh, this is me. Then I think this is kind of a weird one, but when I was growing up, I remember watching both The Colour Purple and Fried Green Tomatoes at the Whistle Stop Cafe as movies, and knowing that they were really, really important and powerful to me personally, that I would watch them over and over again, and I didn't really understand why I was doing that until I read both the books, and both of them have a lot of gender stuff going along as well as queer stuff going on. And even though they're very, very different experiences to mine, I feel like there was something in there about the complexity of gender and sexuality, and that even though the movies did their best to squash that out of it, the books, obviously some sort of flavour was through that. So those two books feel quite important to me in terms of starting that thinking. I'm Sam, and I do comics. Mostly, the main thing that I do is write an autobio comic about myself and my life and my partner and our cat and kind of the things that we get up to. And I also do a comic book series called Family Portraits, which tell the stories of other rainbow New Zealanders and who have stories that are different to mine, because I'm aware that I'm a white guy. Yes, I'm queer and yes, I'm trans, but I have a pretty narrow perspective considering the breadth of stories that our communities have to tell. So Family Portraits is a way of trying to widen out that conversation and tell more stories, because that's really important to me. I feel like queer stories are healing and important and powerful, and they're powerful to people who they're connected with, who share that similar story, but they're also powerful for people who don't share that story, because I think that for me, difference is the place of learning and the place of change and the place of where we can grow from. And so I'm really interested in stories that celebrate difference and don't see it as a problem. So that's what the stories that I try and tell are about. And I use comics because I like the combination of pictures and words together. I think comics is a kind of queer art form because it's not quite writing and it's not quite drawing, but it's both and it's more than that. And it defies definition, and it confuses people because they think that it's going to be a bit childlike or a bit silly, but it's actually very, very powerful and very amazing. So the books that I've brought along today, I could have actually brought my whole bookcase into my workspace, but it would have taken a lot of back and forth. So I've just chosen a few ones to talk about. Annie on My Mind is one of the sweetest, most beautiful books I've ever read, and I quite often go back and read it. Even now, it's a story of two young women who fall in love in New York, and it's sweet and romantic and lovely. It's about kind of the worlds that we create when we're starting to fall in love and starting to realize what love is and how we can, I don't know, I'll start crying about it. But it's lovely. It's also one of the most banned books in the world, apparently. So if you want to feel like a rebel, you should read it. Again, the color purple is my copy's so worn out that the cover's falling off. Is so important and lovely and powerful, and like I said, reflects a story that is not my own, and felt like I did a lot of learning from. I also got really into Sarah Waters for a while, which is a lovely, she's a lovely writer who writes a lot about kind of queerness and gender play, and quite often there's kind of Dickensian mysteries and plot twists, and they're just quite fun books. Tipping the Velvet is about a performer who, I guess drag king would be how you would describe it now. So there's lots of kind of gender play and things like that, which is lovely. When I was first coming out in terms of my sexuality, but as well as my gender, I went trying to find lots of books and things to read so I could find out what was going on, because I didn't have the words to talk about myself. And I found a lot of lesbian romance and lesbian books in the libraries. But it wasn't until I started looking at comics, and particularly web comics, that stories about gender really started coming through, and I started to see myself more and more reflected. So comics for me have been a place where I've been able to discover and find parts of myself that I couldn't find anywhere else. And some of those are ones, like Chaos Comics, which is an amazing kind of teen. I love the teen genre of anything. I watch a lot of Degrassi. I watch a lot of kind of Riverdale kind of shows. But Chaos Comics is about a group of high school kids who are all hiding parts of themselves, and they're all queer in some way. And it has a lot of gender and sexuality and fluidity and funniness, and it's manages to straddle both some really dark and intense stuff as well as just the funny, light silliness of being queer, which is great. And I feel like you can't talk about queer comics without talking about Alison Bechdel and Dykes to Watch Out For, which is an incredibly long-reaching and weirdly socially relevant, as relevant as the time that it was written, book that just explores a bunch of queer people going through their lives kind of from their early 20s till their, I don't know, late 30s maybe. So you should all read that. There's also kind of indie comics that I found online, like My Brain Hurts, which is about queer punk kids, and Morgan Boucher's What's Normal Anyway, which is about a trans mask guy. I don't know. I feel like I could talk about comics all day. But it's so lovely to me that there is more and more queer stories being told and being shared. And one of the shows or pieces of media that I wish was around when I was little was things like Steven Universe and Lumberjanes and She-Ra, which are all television shows and comics as well, but kind of having queerness as part of the world and not making that the problem and just having it there as part of the rich diversity of life is wonderful. I'm going to look at your questions now. So, what are some common misconceptions or shortcomings in attempts at representation that frustrate you? What do people keep getting wrong, or is it a lack of research? Oh man, I have so many feelings about this. I have feelings both as a person who is trying to write queer stories as well as a person who is trying to consume queer stories. And I feel like the best place to start is around representations of trans guys, as I am a trans guy, and that's a particularly fraught area at the moment in terms of how do we tell stories about trans people. Particularly, I don't feel like I'm the right person to talk about trans women's stories. But yes, I have lots of feelings. I feel like whenever you don't have enough stories being told about people, then we put a lot of pressure on the small amount of stories that are being told. And that becomes really hard to share nuance or share complexity or share trickiness. So either we end up with characters who are really, really awful or really, really angelic. And no human is either of those things. Like the best characters, I think, are ones that are both really tricky and complicated and kind of hard, as well as have some redeeming points and are lovable and wonderful. So I think that's it's a hard place for me to write characters that have that, because I also I'm aware that, cis people are reading and I want to be the best representation of trans people that I can, so I can be like, don't hate us, don't persecute us anymore. So it becomes a really fraught thing. And I think the answer to that is that we just need more stories. The more stories we write, the more complexity and the more whole and complicated we can go with stories, I think. I'm not sure. The next one is, do you think, in terms of the lack of research, yes, I definitely think that people are lazy, and so the best people to tell the stories that talk about marginalized identities are the people who belong to that category as well. And I think that's a really important point to make just before I go to the next question. So the next question is, do you think that the stories told in Aotearoa are different or have a different perspective than other stories from other countries? I think for me, they do. I think that we're lucky in terms of the rich history that we have within our communities, and the land that we're on in terms of tangata whenua and how they conceptualize gender and sexuality, as well as our Pacific neighbours. And I think that lends a real richness to the ways in which Pākehā can think about our own queerness and our own genders and our own sexualities as well, that maybe other countries don't have access to. And so I think that there's things there, if we can unpack our own racism and not be so scared of diversity, that we can really challenge ourselves on and learn from and grow from. So yeah, I think that's personally something that I've learned.
And I know that you just got back from a queer comics convention overseas, and so I'm wondering how that plays into this question and answer as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I came away from the Queers and Comics conference in New York was that the resounding feeling I had was like, queer stories are important, and we do get a lot of media from the States, and that's fine. And I think that there's a place for Aotearoa stories as well, and I think that we can all lend towards each other. I was on a panel called Bears, Butchers and Boys Exploring Masculinities within comics, and within that panel we had people from the States, as well as someone from Poland and someone from Russia, not Poland, sorry, France. And so masculinity within different cultures is really, really interesting. I mean, you look at masculinity and what it means to different groups within New Zealand. I grew up in Invercargill, and with that kind of idea of the Southern man, which is a very different conception of what masculinity might look like in Auckland, for example. And so I think that definitely plays a part in informing the sorts of characters that I write and I'm interested in. But I'm also conscious that, my comic is largely read by people from the States, because New Zealand is a very small place and America is a very big place. So sometimes I have to be careful about making it accessible, I guess, within a larger worldwide context. Hannah asks, what do you think of my brother's name is Jessica? Which I don't know, Hannah. I'm not sure. I don't know what that is. So I can't answer that question, I'm afraid.
Hannah, do you have any illumination on what that is? Is it a book that you've read?
I will start rambling on about something else while we wait for Hannah to talk about that. I mean, it's interesting. At the moment, I'm reading Tales of the City, which is a a collection of short stories written in San Francisco. They started being written in the 1970s, and they've been recently. The reason why I started reading them was because I've had them on my bookshelf for years, and the new Netflix series, which has the kind of 2016 iteration of the stories, has started showing, and I wanted to go back and get to know the characters again. And it's so interesting, the stories in which this writer who was a cis white man in the 1970s, writing about his experience in San Francisco through these fictional characters, and it's very funny and light and sometimes very clunky and weird, but the premise, I think, is about that we are just kind of mixed up people who are just trying to do our best within life. And I think with queerness, we need more of those stories to help us have a roadmap of who we are, where we've come from, what we can do, and what kind of ways to process the things in which we do that are sometimes really helpful and sometimes really unhelpful. And it's really hard. I feel like when at the end of last year in Auckland, there was a big furore or kind of conflict around the Pride Parade and what it means to people and who should be part of it and who shouldn't be. And what really struck me about the way in which those conversations were handled was that we have a lot of pain and trauma within our communities, and it's really hard to talk through that because a lot of us are still in pain, whether that's a past pain or a current pain, but we find it hard to connect through that, even though supposedly we're one community. And the reality is that, of course, we're multiple communities across multiple facets. And I think that's something that I like about queerness, but also find really challenging around queerness as well. And I'm still learning and discovering what my place is within that. And especially as someone who has recently been able to grow this very lush looking beard. So I look more and more like a man person than I ever have. And the things that have opened up from the doors that have opened up because of that, the privilege that I have been able to gain is something quite hard to deal with, and also is a kind of big responsibility that I'm still kind of working through. I don't know, I'm rambling now.
I've got a few questions also from email.
Okay.
And so one of them is, I'll go with the lighter one first. If you could be a fruit or vegetable, what would you be?
A raspberry? I would be a raspberry because they're very strange. They have multiple parts, and sometimes they're really, really sweet, and sometimes they're quite tangy, and they can be used in lots of different things. And so that's why I would be a raspberry. And they're also quite cute.
So I want to ask you a question that Sasss was asked as well. What advice would you give to someone who loves writing, creating, and wants to get their work picked up or published?
I think I would give the same advice that Sasss did, of just write, do it. Just put it out there, and put it out there wherever you can, whether that's on the internet or in anthologies or in zines, or give it out to your friends, or go and pitch to publishers. I think that.
How do you pitch to publishers?
Oh, that is the ultimate question, isn't it? I have published. So my first publishing experience, which was when I first started doing comics, was that I saw a post on Tumblr that S. Bear Bergman put out saying, we're going to do an anthology book about gender, pitch me your ideas. And I wrote up a comic and I sent it through and I followed their instructions. That's the number one advice that I would give, is to follow the instructions of the submission process. And I was lucky enough that I got an acceptance, and I've had many rejections ever since that. But that was a really wonderful point that I was like, oh, I can do this. And I come back to that quite often when I feel low about having my work rejected, or my stories for anthologies or things rejected. And I think that's one of the hardest things that, rejection is hard. I find it hard. And so coming back to being able to know where you have been published before, whether that's in your own zines, like a lot of my stuff that I've done is all self-published. I self-published the family portraits, I self-published Rooster Tales, and I self-published a couple of other books. And I've been lucky enough where some people will give me a chance to be published in their books, whether that's S. Bear Bergman, who let me into his anthology and also let me do a kid's book with Flamingo Rampant. But I think just keep putting your stuff out there. I'm in the process of pitching a project to different publishers, comics publishers, and it feels like one of the scariest things to ever do. And I think that you just have to take that risk anyway. And if it doesn't work, then at least you have created and gone through a process and you can show it to your friends. And that's, like, for me, the process of creating comics is more about my own learning rather than the external rewards, although I love the external validation and that people will read them. But I think my main motivation is that comics and writing really helps me to process what it is that I'm feeling. Hannah's wrote back about that the book is written by John Boyle, who wrote The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, and written from the perspective of a cisgender brother of a trans girl. I'm so sorry, Hannah. I haven't read it, but I'm interested to know more about it. It's very interesting the way in which trans stories can be held by different people, and I feel like a lot of the time, particularly in mainstream media, cis people hold the narrative of what it's like for trans people, and I find that to be quite hard and complicated a lot of time. I think there is ways to do it well, but more often than not, I think people go into unhelpful stories and stereotypes which seek to kind of dehumanize trans people and scandalize our existence, and that's unpleasant to engage with. So my preference and my inclination is to trust trans people's telling their own stories, which is not to say that cis people can't ever tell trans stories, but I think there's a lot more work to go into that process to do it ethically.
So one more question, and then I think we'll tie this up.
Oh, wow.
So what do queer books mean to you now? And what, in contrast to or in addition to what they meant to you when you were younger?
Well, like I was saying earlier, like I didn't have access to them earlier because of my own circumstances, but because of my own feelings about myself. So I think they meant something very dangerous and very scary to me when I was younger. And now they mean everything. They mean hopefulness. They mean a chance to explore myself and to learn and grow, to challenge myself, to just feel at home and cozy, or also to feel a little bit like on edge and what does this mean? So I think for me, primarily, I read queer books, queer comics, and queer prose, and quite often I will watch queer TV shows over other things. And I'm lucky enough to be living in a world where that is accessible and there is new stuff coming out all the time, particularly within the queer comic scene. There's just an explosion of queer storytelling across multiple genres as well, which is, yeah, I feel really excited and lucky to be living in this timeline, which is kind of the only good thing about this timeline, I think, in some ways.
Well, thank you so much for coming and talking to everyone. It's been really great to have you. Thank you for your support also of so many rainbow projects in Aotearoa. We are very lucky to have you.
Yay, thank you. And I hope that this inspires people to go out and find their rainbow stories in their libraries. And if not, hit up their local librarians and say, want some more rainbows.
Kia ora. So thank you everyone who tuned in this afternoon. It was great chatting with you. It's great hearing from Sasss and Sam. If you're looking for new rainbow themed books to read, please visit outontheshelves.insideout.org.nz. There are tons of books on there. And you can also, if you don't see one of your favorite books, please submit a review and spread the word about rainbow reading in your community. Thanks so much. Kia ora. Bye.